Welcome to episode 123 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to review a prime slab of jazz funk from 1975, the Headhunters' debut album, Survival of the Fittest. This, of course, is one of Herbie Hancock's great experiments, or at least an offshoot of that experiment. This is the band that propelled Herbie to new heights on his famous Headhunters release from 1973, who are now in 1975 recording on their own, and this is jazz funk of the highest class. The story of the Headhunters' debut album has to start with Herbie Hancock, who has a pedigree and a story which is almost unequaled in American jazz or even American popular music. In the late 60s, like his erstwhile bandmate Miles Davis, Herbie heads into electronic music, and the version that this takes for him is the development of his band called the Mwandishi Band, which was basically a septet that played, again, largely electronic, experimental jazz, what he likes to call sometimes space jazz. Like a lot of the stuff which Herbie had done earlier in the 60s, this was well received by the critics, but it was not that popular commercially, and that was a bit of a problem for Herbie because it was a septet, and that was getting expensive to maintain. This version of Herbie's career comes to its crisis in 1973, when the Mwandishi Band is headlining a series of gigs at the Troubadour Club in LA. The opening group, relatively unknown, had just been signed out of San Francisco. It was an all-female group called the Pointer Sisters. They blew the Mwandishi Band off the stage, so much so that when Herbie's band actually takes the stage, the audience looks kind of puzzled and confused, people start to leave and so on. So taking this embarrassment on board, Herbie and his manager, David Rubinson, decide to pull together a new band. Of the 7 players in the Mwandishi Band, they only kept the reed player, Bernie Maupin. They brought in Paul Jackson, the bassist from the Escovedo Brothers' legendary Bay Area Latin funk band Azteca. Incidentally, that's a band which also featured future Journey guitarist Neil Schon. They brought in percussionist Bill Summers from New Orleans, and on drums they tapped Harvey Mason, who was a key studio player in Los Angeles. Herbie names this new band the Headhunters, and they become part of his drive to cross over to a much funkier sound, but still retain some jazz credibility. They're playing gigs in and around the LA area in 1973, refining their sound, and then towards the end of that year they go into the studio, and they come out with Herbie's classic album, Headhunters. That album, powered by its successful lead-off single Chameleon, eventually sells over 1 million copies and puts Herbie right back squarely on the commercial music map. That's followed in 1974 by Thrust and in 1975 by Manchild. And with each of these, Herbie's sound gets funkier and more appealing from a crossover perspective. All 3 of these albums do extremely well commercially. The group with Hancock would eventually have one other funky album up their sleeves, that's Secrets, released in 1976. But after Manchild in 1975, Herbie's attention started to wander back to more traditional or classic jazz, back to the sound he'd had with the Miles Davis Quintet, and he begins to think about pulling together a number of alumni from the Miles Davis era, which eventually becomes the project VSOP. So in other words, his attention is no longer on the jazz funk stuff. The rest of the Headhunters, however, were fully committed to continuing on that path. They'd recently brought in Mike Clark on drums after Harvey Mason said he didn't want to tour, and they replaced Herbie Hancock not with another keyboardist, but with a guitarist, Blackbird McKnight. In the period from 1975 to 1977, they released 2 albums. This one, their debut, Survival of the Fittest in 1975, and Straight from the Gate in 1977. This album was recorded at Wally Heider Studios in San Francisco in 1975, and it's produced by David Rubinson. The players include Blackbird McKnight on guitar, Bill Summers on percussion and vocals, Benny Maupin on reeds, piano and vocals. Paul Jackson plays bass, and he also does the lead vocal on God Make Me Funky, which is the key track in this record. And as I mentioned, the great Mike Clark is on drums, and more about him later. In addition to the core members of the band, there are a few other players that are notable on here. Those include Joyce Jackson, who has a really nice turn on flute, and Harvey Mason, the former drummer of the band, who sits in here and there for Mike Clark. I'd also mention the Pointer Sisters, who were label mates of the Headhunters and had been part of that bill which had kind of embarrassed the Mwandishi group and led to the creation of this band in the first place. And ironically or not, they're here as backup singers on the lead-off track. This is a really good album. And maybe the key piece of why it's so great is the rhythm section, which has Mike Clark on drums and Paul Jackson on bass. No offense to Harvey Mason, who himself is an incredible drummer and was a mainstay of so many great jazz funk records in the 70s, but Mike Clark is phenomenal and a major reason why this album is so great. And it's kind of an interesting story how he comes to be involved with this band in the first place. He was heavily into jazz, but he also made a lot of money in the latter part of the 60s playing in James Brown cover bands and perfecting funk rhythms. One day in Oakland, he's playing with his band, and Paul Jackson appears in the audience. Now, they didn't know each other at that point, and eventually Jackson comes up to Clark and says, "Wow, I really dig what you're playing. I'd love to come up and jam with you guys." And Clark says, "What do you play?" And Jackson says, "Well, I play bass, but I also play organ." So he comes up and he jams on organ, and he's fantastic. They get along really well on stage. Later on that night, Clark gets back to his place, and Jackson has showed up, and he's got a bunch of hash and some wine, and in they go, and friendship is sealed for life. The two of them got a place together in Oakland, and it quickly became a hub for musicians in the East Bay and for the development of what was to become known as the Oakland Sound. And as Clark tells the story, very much adjacent to the Black Power movement and learning from all that, as well as the two of them being directly involved in the development of the new funk sound. It's at this time they end up writing what becomes the lead-off track and the big single off this album, God Make Me Funky. Jackson and Clark were living at the time right next to a southern barbecue joint. They used to eat there all the time, but they used to rehearse next door. And at one point, the woman who owned that particular outlet said, "Would you guys make me a jingle?" So right there in a cocktail napkin, they kind of put it together and they went back and recorded it. And what they recorded was a prototype of God Make Me Funky, which was used as a jingle on the radio in Oakland and became hugely popular. Clark at this point in 72, 73 was still gigging with his local funk bands. Jackson, as mentioned, had this gig with Azteca, the Escovedo Brothers project. And in 1973, when Herbie decides to blow up the Mwandishi project and needs to bring together a whole new band, he auditions for bassist and Jackson gets the gig. Eventually, after Herbie's album Headhunters is released, Harvey Mason, the drummer on that record, says he doesn't want to tour. Herbie needs a new drummer to go on the road. And Jackson says, "You know, you should really listen to Clark. He's got some great funk chops." Side one starts with that classic jazz funk track, God Make Me Funky, and the recording of this song has some interesting accidental aspects. They only did a couple of takes of this song, and the second take was a real winner. But during the recording of that take, Clark encounters a problem because the springs on his snare drum, which create that rattling sound, broke. So his snare drum in the original recording sounds more like a tom-tom and not like a snare drum. He wanted to re-record it, but David Rubinson said, "No, actually, that's a really good take. We need to have a different solution." So what they end up doing is taking a metal waste paper basket, turning it upside down, putting a speaker inside of it to broadcast the track of the take, and also a microphone to pick up the rattling of the waste paper basket. So what happens is the percussive sound of the drums, when played back from the speaker inside that waste basket, creates a kind of ersatz snare drum sound. He's still kind of upset about this to this day if you read any interviews of him. But the proof in the pudding, I think, is that this particular drum track has been sampled a zillion times by all kinds of hip-hop producers because it is such a clean, satisfying rhythm. Jackson's bass then comes in, which is great, and then he does his vocal, which for my money is as good as anything Roy Ayers ever did. And on top of that, the Pointer Sisters singing backup, which is just electric. Then we have a bit of a change of pace in the album with the song Music, which is more of a spiritual jazz number than, certainly not a funk monster anyway. The last track on side one, Here and Now, has two very distinct elements. It starts off very beautifully and reflectively with Joyce Jackson's flute, a really lovely piece of music. Then it totally builds an intensity and a much faster tempo. You have lots of percussion, and then you have Maupin soloing on a saxello, which is kind of an archaic version of a soprano sax. Side two begins with Daffy's Dance, and we're right back into the full-on funk. McKnight's contributions are a little bit selective on this record, but he really shows up on this track, and he has this fantastic tone on his overdub solo later in this tune. Rima as a track is very down-tempo and mysterious. It's possibly the best pure jazz track on this record. This is almost like spiritual jazz, but it's slightly more suspenseful than that, and it has this kind of airy, spacious coda. Very beautiful piece of music. One more track to go, but these guys were not out of ideas because the final track is a real burner as well. This is If You've Got It, You'll Get It. It has kind of this weaving opening with lots of percussion, and then a righteous funky groove with bass clarinet over top. And then following that, probably McKnight's most substantial contribution to the whole record, which is a completely wailing-ass guitar solo. This is very much a fusion-y guitar solo, and I always feel you're getting close to true fusion when a song starts to become a little bit challenging and aversive, but luckily they pull back from that, and we're back to the fat rhythms to close out the song and the album. Survival of the Fittest, albeit without Herbie Hancock on board, is a continuation of Hancock's experiment of fusing legit jazz with truly funky rhythms. As much as Hancock's original album, Headhunters, is by far the more famous record, I think this album is actually superior. Not just because the embrace of funk is less tentative, but because there's a bit more discipline to the production choices. There's less self-indulgence on here, and there's much more focus, I think, on coherent songwriting. Whether you're a jazz fan or a funk fan or a fan of the fusion of those traditions in the 1970s, this album, Survival of the Fittest, is an absolute must-have, and it's a 4.5 out of 5 star record.